Hey, everybody. This is Al. We are at the Morgan Library, properly the Morgan Library and Museum here in, whoa, that's a big voice I've got. It's just such a great thing that we're able to do this. We took the webcast on the road. The webcast is not easy to do on the road. It's sort of easy for us and really easy for the people who came. Not so easy for Chris and Zach. So right from the start, we need to put our hands together for Chris and Zach. There they are. Look, hi, hey. This is amazing. This is, I don't know, how many webcasts have we done since 2012? Well, it would be 11 times 8 when we're all done. 88 fucking webcasts. 88. So we're at about 85, and then we did some off-season ones. So we're not very practiced at this at all. Anyway, let me say hi to people, have a couple of announcements, and then I have a humdinger of a first question to ask, and we'll see where it goes. And we have a seat here, so I just want to thank Sal. Sal is right here, who's on the Morgan staff. Sal, can we get a mic to Sal Mandana? Hi, Sal. Sorry to put you on the spot right now. How are you?
Good.
Okay, so what is your role here at the Morgan?
I am an associate curator of manuscripts in Christine's department.
It's the real deal. You're the real. You're what this library is about.
Yeah, and some other things.
And some other things. And how did you get stuck doing ModPo duty tonight?
Well, you know, Christine is my boss, so I don't have.
Okay. Well, pass the mic to Christine. This is Christine Nelson, everybody. Now, Christine.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, let's thank Christine. We approached Christine, I don't know, 6 months ago, and can we do a webcast?
I think you asked me maybe 3 or 4 years ago. We finally did it.
Yeah, we finally did it. That's right. So it's not the easiest thing to do because it's kind of after hours, and so Christine, thank you. And people in New York love the Morgan. I mean, we got such a nice response from people when we said we were going to do the Morgan. Would you like to give the mic back to Mandana, but then you, Christine, come to the chair up here? All right, I'm going to say hi to people, and then we're going to get started. We have, in the Hangouts, we have Erica. Hi, Erica.
Hi, Al.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. It's good to see you. And we have Gabe, who's in Chicago. Hi, Gabe.
Hello. How you doing?
Hey. And there's Jake Marmer, who's in Palo Alto.
How's it going, Al?
Hey, so Jake has a 6 p.m. Pacific time, 9 p.m. New York time, which is useless because which New Yorker is going to get on a plane and get out there in 3 hours? So if you're watching from Northern California, get in your car now because you'll barely make it in 3 hours. Yeah, in Silicon Valley. And you're going to be having a meetup with Amaris Kachansky, who's not here tonight because she's prepping. I'm kidding. Hi, Jake.
Hey. Yes, please come if you're watching this and you're in the area.
If you're in Northern California, yes, get there. And it's at the, what's the name of the coffee shop?
Red Rock Cafe.
Red Rock Cafe. You took me there once. It's not the Red Rock Cafe. It's called Red Rock Coffee. I thought you took me there once. Anyway, never mind. Yeah. Jason is here. Hi, Jason.
Hello, Al.
Hey, buddy. You're in Philly. It's, a long way away. Yeah. Or actually South Jersey, probably. Max McKenna in Chicago.
Hi, Al.
Hey, Max. And we have here Allie Castleman. And it's great to have Allie Castleman live and in person because usually she's either in Newark or New York City, but here she is, Allie Castleman, the famous Allie Castleman.
Hi, everyone.
That's really cool. And, of course, we have Anna. Hi, Anna.
Of course. Huh?
And we're not snapping for Anna. We're not doing anything for Anna. Okay. And Davey is here, made the trip from Philly.
Hi, Al.
Hi, Davey. Are you going to do this game again, or are we just going to get the mic to you?
There we go.
'Cause it's this. Okay. And we've already said hi to Christine. All right. So we're all here, and we've got lots of friends, and I hope everybody's going to be very talkative here. So I just want to do a couple of announcements, and then we'll get going. Kim Harrison. So Kim Harrison is a new ModPoer, I believe, in Hudson, Quebec, in Canada, and she gets together with her poetry group, and her poetry group is called the Greenwood Poets in Hudson. And they went to her house in Hudson, the gang did, They have a monthly meeting, and they did a cut-up exercise to celebrate the Tristan Tzara, how to make a Dadaist poem from ModPo, and they had a good time. And so Kim was enthusing about ModPo to the people in the room, and one of the other people in the room started to laugh and to throw up her hands, and it turned out that she, total coincidence, up there in Hudson, a name like Hudson, I'm just imagining that it's far north, but it might not be. I don't know. Anyway, Quebec is big. It was Cassandra from years 1 and 2 of ModPo. Her real name, it turns out, is Sandra Stevenson. She goes by Cassandra. She's famous in ModPo, and she made an audio of Ron Silliman's Albany, which is on the main syllabus. Anyway, there they were, and they had this kind of union of ModPo people up there in Hudson, and I loved hearing about that. Okay. One more announcement. So Davey put up a thread called Disability Access in ModPo. Davey, in like a sentence, what was that all about and why?
That was about asking folks to share their experiences about whether and in what way they've found ModPo accessible and the kinds of relationships to disability and embodiment and cognition that ModPo makes available to folks.
So there's been a pretty good response, and Davey and Anna, and I think I, are co-writing. This is why I'm not involved. We're co-writing, and when we're done, it will have been co-wrote. And we're doing it for what? What are we doing it for?
The MLA Guide to Teaching Literature Online.
That's incredible. They need us. We know something about teaching online.
That's the point.
Yeah, that is the point. Anyway, I just want to read, with permission, Clarissa Stein, who's from Australia. She wrote this really nice piece, and that'll put everybody in the mood. And I hope that whatever you have to say about disability and access, that you'll go to that thread and you'll contribute. Clarissa wrote, "Hi, Davey. This is an important project. I'm living in a rural region in the north of a shire that concentrates mostly on development in its south. I have been involved in various local community groups. In many, I was a founding member to get specific groups running, but these days I cannot leave my house before 11 o'clock because of a disability, which the disability organization calls but a medical problem. Irrespective, I have been trying to get heard and included, but the latter seems only to be lip service." So MOOCs, massive open online courses, those things much ridiculed in 2012, continued to be ridiculed in 2013, forgotten about in 2014, revived and ridiculed again in 2015, and so on, and now completely forgotten, and there are only a couple of us still really earnestly doing it. MOOCs have given me a new life with their worldwide community. I started with one at Stanford, continued with Iowa, then Coursera, where I found ModPo, and when I mentioned on the phone, Clarissa called recently, in one of the webcasts that ModPo won't lose me, I meant it. This course has literally given me a new life. It has rekindled, unlike any other, my involvement in poetry, for strange as it may seem, like Pasternak, who could not write for some years after the Russian Revolution. I had lost my voice after 9/11, which felt like a different disability altogether. Slow Po will be a daily treat over the coming year. So thank you, Clarissa. It's a really beautiful thing. All right, I'm going to make a list of the Week 8 poems, and then I'm going to start with a bit of a surprise. I'm going to ask for responses. So we have Ron Silliman, Albany, and Bart. We have Lynn Haginian, My Life. We have a few pages from My Life, a few entries, a few years. We have Bob Perlman's Chronic Meanings, which is a pre-elegy for Leland Hickman, his friend and editor. We have a Charles Bernstein poem, In a Restless World Like This Is. We have Susan Howe and Emily Dickinson. We have Harriet Mullins, Sleeping with the Dictionary. And in ModPo Plus, we have a lot of stuff. And this is a room full of longtime ModPo people. They're probably all up. Shoshana, hi. They're probably all up on ModPo Plus. I'll just name a couple of ModPo Plus items in case my colleagues want to talk about it. There's a bunch of Ray Armantrout, including a favorite of ours called Overhearing. There's some Robert Grenier, which, he has this box of poem cards called Sentences. Some more Charles Bernstein, some Tyrone Williams, who doesn't mind being sort of thought of as negative way of putting it, but doesn't mind being thought of as a latter generation language poet. Of course, we have Larry Eigner, a lot of Eigner poems. Lydia Davis, who doesn't write poems, doesn't talk about herself as writing poems, but writes micro stories in the language poetry mode, is in there. Bruce Andrews and Meme Bursenbrugger, whom everybody loves. All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask Christine Nelson to read Emily Dickinson's My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun. Now, why are we doing that? By the way, when I block copied it, and here come the glasses. When I block copied it, I lost the stanzas, and I apologize for that. Okay, so Christine's going to read it. Everybody knows why we're doing that. It's not week 1, it's week 8. However, Susan Howe, the camera work is like, you don't even have to say. We've been doing this so long together. Susan Howe writes, My Emily Dickinson. Anna, in a sentence, why my Emily Dickinson? How dare she?
What?
Well, I'm leading you on.
No, it's a tremendous book. It's a book that is attempting to, and I think succeeds in, considering a deeply personal and textual relationship with and to Emily Dickinson as a poet, as a thinker, kind of reclaiming her as a really radical, really experimental poet. From folks who didn't think that she was any of those things.
So it's a new Dickinson for the language poetry era or the language poetry mode. It's a Dickinson that's very languagey, for one thing. And it's a Dickinson whose identity was languaged and all that stuff. So I'm going to ask, so this book, My Emily Dickinson, is kind of a book-length riff on this poem. There's a lot of other stuff in it, to say the least. But I thought what we would do, friends, is to start hearing the poem, and then my question is going to be, and I'm going to ask almost everybody to comment on this. Questions could be, okay, how does one look back at this poem in particular, or at Dickinson in general, and how is that align with, how is that commensurate with the concerns of the language poets? How is this a language poem? It's a really cool question. Thank you very much. Christine, will you read it?
The whole thing.
The whole thing's not that long.
I've never read this before, so here goes. My life had stood a loaded gun in corners till a day. The owner passed, identified, and carried me away. And now we roam in sovereign woods, and now we hunt the doe, and every time I speak for him, the mountains straight reply. And do I smile such cordial light upon the valley glow? It is as a Vesuvian face had let its pleasure through. And when at night, our good day done, I guard my master's head, 'tis better than the eider duck's deep pillow to have shared. To foe of his, I'm deadly foe. None stir the second time. On whom I lay a yellow eye, or an emphatic thumb, though I than he may longer live, he longer must than I. For I have but the power to kill, without the power to die.
Thank you, Christine. That was pretty good, wasn't it? Okay, so we're going to go this is a lightning round, people. We're going all the way around. Table, hangouts, everybody. I'll tell you who's on deck, and all you have to do is say really briefly one of the many ways. All you have to do is one way in which this is kind of a language poem, or you might say a precursor to language poetry, or you might just get inside as best you can the subjectivity, the subject position of My Emily Dickinson to basically say, this is a poem for our time. This is a poem for our generation. So Allie will be first, and then Erica.
I was really hoping not to be first.
You can skip.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, every time I read this poem, I'm just flummoxed anew. It's so difficult. But I think those last two lines, for I have but the power to kill without the power to die. You could kind of create an analogy between like the writer executing and just language as a fabric that is not immortal, but like just is available for everyone, and that will carry through beyond like one instance of, of someone using it.
Fantastic. Erica, you're next. This is a lightning round, and then we'll go to Davey. What makes this a language poem?
It's use of language in a way where words can stand up against context. They stand up against the passing of time. It's not that words are out of context, but it's that it's a more inviting, universalizing, experiential reading.
Fantastic. Davey is next, and then Jake.
So in the passages that we get from my Emily Dickinson, Susan Howe thinks of Dickinson in two phrases, that she's dealing with higher female education and unladylike outside reading. And so I might think of this as a language poem by the way that it exposes structures of power to be able to take them for its own work.
And that's such a language poetry hallmark, right? I mean, it's really what all these poems are about this week.
Yep.
Jake, followed by Anna.
So maybe I'll say fragmentation here, thoughts that are unfinished or thoughts that overlay other thoughts or thoughts that kind of come together into one single line. And it is much more thought-like than a more typical storytelling narrative.
Yeah, I mean, so in a way, when you say what you just said, Jake, one imagines Ray Armantrout, a young poet, reading Dickinson and just feeling like, wow, I can do this? She did this all these years ago? This is really experimental. I mean, we say, as a cliche, that Emily Dickinson was ahead of her time. I think she was misunderstood by 3 separate generations of well-meaning critics. Until we get to this point when Susan Howe does her thing. Okay, did I say Anna was next?
You did.
Okay, good, and then Max. Lightning round.
Yeah, my thought follows from Jake's. I really hear parataxis in this. I hear like a lot of poets are going to take up this call that like shit doesn't need to be sequential.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, people have cracked their heads on trying to figure out how to make some kind of sequence out of this. They can't even figure out, I mean, is she the gun? Is she not the gun? How is it gendered? I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Max, followed by Gabe.
And to build off what Anna said, I think what makes it languagey also is the paratactic relationship to biography or to narrating personal experience. It's, I mean, the My Life, Head Stood a Loaded Gun cues us into Heginian's My Life a little bit too, I think. Just thinking about disrupting this sequential way of narrating biography.
Fantastic. That's great. So we've connected to Heginian, and in fact, the first two words are my life. Nice going, Max. How come we didn't notice that before? Gabe, followed by Jason.
To follow off of all of that, I kind of see it as a poem about clauses in the same way that in A Restless World, like this is, and you see just how like stumbled and difficult and hard to parse the causal relationships are in both of those poems. And that's just, that for the language poets is just an interesting technique of playing with language. I mean, to go off of Ali, if language is a fabric, it's at least partly because it's sewn together. So people are kind of playing with unthreading.
That's perfect. Jason and then Christine.
Yeah, my thoughts are pretty literal. We have the hyphens, which are like little lines of shot, and I was also focusing on like Max, the opening with My Life, and how that breaks against the last lines about I cannot die. Plus, we get through the language we get sound of gunshots, not literally in the language, but my mouth is of Vesuvius is pretty explosive.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I love the way Vesuvius appears there. Christine, you're the last one.
I
I
haven't been
think. Yep.
I haven't been studying the language poets, so I'm going to give my own response, which is
Good.
that I'm very much aware of us all being in this room together in various ways. Us, sort of sitting with Emily Dickinson in a way, sitting with Susan Howe, who has been here to look at Emily Dickinson manuscripts with.
I knew you were going to
Right?
plug that, but that was so much fun, that
Yes.
show that you did.
Yeah.
It wasn't you.
Well,
it
I
was-
wasn't me. It was my colleague
That's
Carolyn Vega and
Carolyn
Mike
Vega,
Kelly
right.
from Amherst.
And
But
we made some videos with Carolyn.
But what I've learned, what I've listened to Susan say multiple times that stays with me as a curator in a place like this, is how she went through that experience of feeling excluded in places like this. And so, it's so great to have you all here, both virtually and in this room, as just as a welcoming gesture. And there are ways that this poem, or I react to this poem by feeling excluded because I haven't figured out a way in yet. And so those questions of accessibility in a different sense are very much on my mind as I read this with
Wow.
you.
Can we snap fingers for Christine Nelson? Would you like to get a regular seat? And I'm going
Yes.
to call up maybe John. Are you willing, John, to come up to the front? You can say no. Oh, I don't know. We don't know yet. We improvise everything. That's so nice. Let's hear it for John. All right. Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to invite Max to tell us which poem we should talk about next. Max, Silliman, Haginian, Perlman, Bernstein, Mullen, maybe an Eigner, Lydia Davis. What do you think, Max? He's deciding.
He's muted.
So maybe you could go there.
Well, but we didn't hear that. You got you.
So language.
You unmuted too slowly.
Well, let's go with the chronic meanings then.
Chronic meanings. Okay. How about, Chris Martin, if we listen to a little bit of chronic meanings? And by the way, who is watching Twitter?
Me.
Okay. And who's watching the thread? I guess I am.
Also me.
And you, also you. Okay. All right. So we're going to week 8. I seem to have lost one of my windows, but that's okay. I can handle this. Bob Perlman, chronic reading meanings. Listen to, here it is. Okay. Here we go. Okay, we got a problem with, it's conflicting with the Hangouts. He did mute the Hangouts. Yeah, Hangouts are muted. Technical malfunction.
Please stand by. While Zach fixes everything.
Yeah. Zach Gardner, ladies and gentlemen.
Look at the poems on my phone.
Oh, yeah. At least these you're usually able to find.
You want to try it?
Oh, and you have that PDF.
Chronic Meanings has. And there was a note that I think really is important to the poem.
This is not what we want. This is the commentary. So hold on. How's everybody doing? You having a good, listen to it and perform it. Okay, good. Here we go. He's drinking water. I was there when he recorded this.
Chronic Meanings for Lee Hickman. The single fact is matter. 5 words can say only. Black sky at night, reasonably. I am the irrational residue. Blown up chain link fence. Next morning, stronger than ever. Midnight, the pain is almost. The train seems practically expressive. A story familiar as a society has broken into bands. The 19th century was sure characters in the withering capital. The heroic figure straddled the clouds, enveloped the tallest, tens of thousands of drops. The monster struggled with Milton. On our wedding night, the sorrow burned deeper than.
So, this is a poem that was written after Lee Hickman, who was the editor of Trembler magazine in LA, got a diagnosis of HIV positive. And, but it was written for Lee, before Lee passed of the disease. And in fact, Lee had a chance to literally set the type of this poem before it was published. So it's for Lee Hickman. Okay, so I'm going to ask, John, you're going to get a shot at this, but we'll give you a little time to think about it. I'm going to ask Jake. No, it will totally. I'm going to ask Jake to start, and then Mandana, I'd like you to give the mic to Susanna in the back there. Can you do that? Okay, Jake, and then we'll go to John and Davey. So, Jake, you're first.
Is there a specific prompt?
No, whatever. No prompt. What do
No
you think?
prompt, okay.
It's an experiment. What's the experiment?
Well, the experiment, I think we've talked about this, that every sentence is cut off prematurely. And that's the form and the concept. And just
How many
looking at
words, Jake? How many words?
5 per line?
5 words per line, and there's a period.
Yes.
Yep.
Right. Period where you don't expect you don't expect it to be in the middle of a cut-off phrase. Okay, so what I'm curious about, in as much as we talk about in the context of language poetry, parataxis, when we talk about kind of non-sequential order of these lines, that one doesn't have to follow another logically. I'm interested in thinking a little bit about this further and just like seeing, well, is there any intention to the order, or is it, or what does this sequence anyway represents? Because, you know, just a collection of things that are in here. Like some things seem conversational, others seem a little bit more literary, some refer to the world outside, some are very kind of introspective, and the tone seems different. So I would be interested in talking a little bit about that, in seeing how one line follows the other, and if we can discern some kind of rhythms in the meaning.
So you wound up posing the question, and you wound up doing the Al thing, which is to frame the investigation. So what you said essentially, we're going to turn to John next. How you feeling? What you said essentially is, we've got a kind of a paratactic, listy, non-sequential, out of order, non-cause and effect list, or series of sentences that don't seem to relate to each other. So what is it that holds them together? And the language poets come up with a concept for an experiment. In this case, can I write about Lee Hickman not through the content, but through the experiment of cutting myself short in sort of due deference and honor of his situation? So the experiment becomes not the content. It becomes cutting yourself short of any thought that you have, and that winds up unifying the thoughts that are otherwise not unified. John, what do you think of this? How did you react emotionally to this experiment?
Well, I probably would have.
Do we have John's mic on?
Oh,
yeah. You just get closer.
Oh, I'm sorry. I probably would have reacted with some indifference had I not known the biographical element, so that, as both of you have said, the notion of being cut off prematurely, is pretty obviously a reference to the fate of his friend or editor. So that makes it more interesting and meaningful, and perhaps there is some intimate contact that would be known only to those two through some of these phrases.
Right.
That
Can you pick one out that would imply, that would lead you to think? Because we do read, even novels. Sorry, I'm a novel reader. Even when we read novels, we do a lot of work of imagining a life that's not in that chapter, but is sort of between the lines or off stage. And here, all we can do is imagine a whole bunch of stuff going on off stage. So can you pick a line that suggests, oh, yes, they must have had that in common, or...
I don't think that I would do that, particularly because I'm not noticing anything here, and all the lines seem somewhat generic to me, which may be part of the point. As a formal exercise, which you guys were talking about, the fives going on, in some ways, the form has a chance of unifying something that seems aimless and having no meaning, or that the lack of meaning may be something that's called into question by the title.
Yeah.
What is chronic in this?
Yeah.
And some of that may have to do with the person that he's referring to that's offered the dedication.
Yeah.
But meaning itself is, perhaps because it's so cut off, called into question as well.
Yeah. John, you're good.
Oh.
Isn't John great? That was so great. Susanna, follow that. Hi, Susanna. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. And I noticed that it's quite different when you read the poem, and that's the last time, I guess, a couple of years ago, I should say, that I read it. And now I listen to it, and it's quite different because all these gaps, they come across very astringent, I think very stark in a way. So there are really gaps, and there's nothing that is cut out as if he figured something was there, but there's really nothing. So I feel it's a poem of loss, and the loss is this emptiness, I think, and it's also probably to come to terms with HIV in general during that time, what it meant, and it wasn't quite clear how it would proceed with treatments for people, and so people were probably overwhelmed. That's what I get, this feeling.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to Davey, and then we're going to go to a phone call, and we'll see where that takes us. So, by the way, for those of you who haven't called, 610-616-3208, 610-616-3208. By the way, Susanna, thank you for that. Typically, our second caller is the one who gets the book. But today, since we have so many people here, and we don't really want to schlep the book back to Philly and then Lily has to mail it, you're the second commentator for the audience. Technically, John was, because Christine was first, but she's our host. So we'll just, this is a Meme Bersenberger book, Hello, the Roses. It's so good. And we don't have to mail it. Lily, wherever you are, we don't have to mail this book. Okay, Sal, will you pass this back? Thank you. All right. Davey, a thought on chronic meanings, and then we're going to turn to the caller, and whatever the caller says, I'm going to ask Gabe to be the first to respond to it.
Can I share one tweet while we're on chronic meanings still?
Yes, tweet.
From JRBM Garner. They write, I met a young man in college
Jim Bumgarner.
Yeah.
So we know him.
Yeah. I met a young man in college who became a great friend for many years. He died of AIDS in 2000. This poem, Chronic Meanings, screams at me for him.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. Davey.
I want to pick up on what you were saying, John, and think about chronic for a minute. And think about chronic as if someone has a chronic medical condition, that it is a pervasive and structural part of their life. And to think about, is meaning a kind of chronic condition? And I think that the work that does for me here is that, like, this is really normal quotidian language, especially if you're a person who deals in literary spaces and is using literarily related language all the time. And the way that I find this poem most affecting is to think about the meaning of all of this quotidian language as being related to the loss of your friend. That, like, every quotidian word that you would use would be about the end of someone's life.
That's right.
And that feels like what the constraint of the 5-word line does is that it's both, those lines are both over because Lee Hickman's life is over, and because this is in the middle of one instantiation of the AIDS crisis, one version of the AIDS crisis in the U.S., but also because Bob Perlman can't get through these sentences without thinking of the loss of his friend. Doesn't matter what they're about. Doesn't matter what the language is about. It's not that like this particular place or thing makes me think of you, but it's like every time I use language, like I had this constitutive language relationship with you, and now language makes me think of you.
It's really, really, really well said. Very powerful. I'm teaching with Anna and Lily this semester a course on really it's about survivor testimony, particularly of the Holocaust. And one of the things that we run into, for instance, in Primo Levi's writing, The Periodic Table, is there's the language of before, there's a language of during, and then there's the language of after. Well, the Periodic Table, the chapters that precede chronologically the during, are infused in this same way with the after. There's no such thing as reading a sentence in the Periodic Table about his life before Auschwitz without reading into every sentence the after. So during becomes an after, and then after gets put back on the before. And I think what Bob is talking about, and this is what you said, is, you know, black sky at night reasonably. Well, there might be just a dark night before, but now there's no such thing as a black night that's not affected by this loss. Which is one of the things that writing can do, because you can't, like John said, well, if I didn't know about this information, I wouldn't have read it that way, which is the most amazing thing to think about. Like, you could read this poem and not think about this. But now that we've talked about it, you'll never read it the same way again. You can't, there's no before for you either in reading the poem, which is, you know, pretty powerful thing a poem can do. So we're going to take a call, and then we're going to ask Gabe to comment. Gabe loves this kind of thing. So, who's on the phone?
Al, there's a big event happening tonight in Texas for American baseball fans, and that is Game 7 of the World Series.
Except there's one person who's not watching the game. Or
Down
not
in
watching
Texas,
the pregame.
there's one person not watching the
Must
pregame.
be Philip Drexler.
Bingo.
Hey, Phil. Phil, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'll be rooting for the Astros.
Say that again, Phil.
I'll be rooting for the Astros tonight.
Okay, well, that's fine. No, I mean, actually, pretty much everybody in New York, and I'm really a New Yorker, by the way, they're either fans of a team that didn't fare well, or they're fans of a team that really didn't fare well. And the latter is in a division with the Nats, so therefore we root for the Astros. Yeah. Anyway.
I understand that. I'm actually a Baltimore Orioles fan.
Oh, well, I'm sorry about
they're
that.
the worst team in baseball right
Yes,
now,
they
and
are.
I grew up in Houston, so
Okay.
I might as well be an Astros fan, right?
So, Phil, can you ask your question, and then we'll take it offline, and we'll have Gabe
Okay.
respond to it. Thank you.
It's more of a comment than a question, but it ends up being a question, I suppose. An hour ago, Al, I sent you an excellent essay that I actually found on Wikipedia. There are actually good things on Wikipedia. And it was an essay by a gentleman about Larry Eigner. And he comments about the fact that Larry Eigner, he talks quite directly about his disability in his prose and in his nonfiction work, but he hardly ever talks about it directly in his poetry. And he talks about him as a language poet. And he compared him to a mobile artist.
Yes.
He said his poems are like language objects that are dangled on those 8.5 by 11 pages and arranged on the page like mobile objects.
Yes.
And he also said on a second level, the objects in his room are dangled that way in the context of the poems.
Yeah.
And then on the third level, the objects that he sees outside his window are dangled that way.
Phil, this
And
is
I
a
thought it was a beautiful metaphor.
I got the link to the article. Yeah.
Al, and ask you to copy it to Davey and to the to Anna
Yeah.
to put in the TRC.
Thank you.
I think it's a beautiful idea.
It is. I will.
That essay. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay. Thank you, Phil. I will. I'll post that link. Generally, will you take the response off air so somebody else can call? And I'm going to focus the question for Gabe, and then we're going to go from there. Thank you so much for the call, Phil, and good luck in the game tonight. So, Gabe, I don't know if you have access to this, Gabe, but in the ModPo Plus syllabus, there's a poem called Corner Stop Sign. Can you go to it?
Got it.
You got it. Great. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to ask you to comment, and then I'm going to turn to Erica, Max, and Allie, and then we'll invite somebody in the room, but you'll have to hear it because you don't have the text. All right, so this is a corner stop sign. Corner stop sign. Stop war. Those are all caps. Stop war. Organization of the cars. Arrowy traffic on the bigger road. No clouds cross the sky. Space. Buildings. Windows. Reminds me of a poem we talked about last week. Okay. So, Gabe, what are your thoughts? Just start anywhere. I mean, you might want to start with Stop War. What the heck? Amazing, huh?
Yeah, I'll start with something else, but then I'll get to that.
Okay.
So, just like a historical note for people. So, a lot of the language poets are thinking about language as material. And so, concrete poetry, poetry as objects, and visual poetry is so big for them. You've got Robert Grenier, who's doing a lot of stuff like that. You've got Aram Saroyan, but even you've got like visual artists like Robert Smithson, who makes this thing called a heap of language, which is just like a bunch of text on itself. And so that kind of text like an object, like the mobile analogy, is totally spot on. Partly just because it's changing your relationship to language as you thinking of it like a real meaning. Trying to kind of demystify language a little bit.
Yeah.
War seems like it's likely a real stop sign, which had some kind of sticker or graffiti under it that said war, kind of referencing
Something
that.
he saw out the window.
Like, yeah, we're referencing that feminist 70s stop rape graffiti, which then was stickers. So it seems like it's a real observation. And Larry Agner's poems are mostly these observational, mostly naturalistic, very short, all untitled sort of poem objects that have this lineation. And the thing that people talk about with Aigner is there's a kind of two-sided thing to pay attention to. One is the real conditions of the writing, the speaking, and the physicality of it. So Larry Aigner had a lot of difficulty writing and speaking, and so the poems are short. They are written observationally because that was a lot of the way in which he experienced the world, as we talked about for somebody like Schuyler. But secondly, there's a lot of thought in that. It's not just that the poems are just a circumstance, but rather there's a real idea about what language can be, in the sense that it's both observational, it's descriptive, but it's also physical, and it's mathematical in a way.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabe. That was really fantastic. I want to turn to Erica, then Max, then I'm going to call on somebody in the room. Eric Fretz, would you be willing to comment on this poem? You can say no. You really can, because you don't have the poem in front of you, do you? Okay. I have a copy that I can lend someone. Shoshana, would you be willing? Fantastic. Here's a copy. Okay, Max. Oh, sorry, Erica, then Max.
I would echo what Gabe says. The poem on the page is so beautifully intentional as far as the way that the text is laid out that it's just clear to me that in the composition process, Aigner was thinking quite carefully about what he was doing. It's interesting. I also tend to think of Aigner more as part of like the Black Mountain School group of writers, like Robert Creeley, for example. And I'm always interested in the link that there seems to be between that group of writers and the language poets. Whereas I think that they were up to different things, but maybe driven by similar questions.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Thank you. Max, your thought on this?
I wonder what happens to this poem when we put it in the context of the Whitmanian impulse that we've been tracing throughout the course. This is like a city poem, kind of, right?
Yeah.
But what's interesting is the lack of people, the lack of denizens in his observations here. I'm really struck by what he talks about, the organization of the cars, presumably this rather orderly traffic that he's observing. It's arrowy.
Arrowy, yeah.
And then this ending with space, buildings, windows, like just the raw materials of, or really the most abstracted forms of a cityscape without any of that blab of the pave.
Yeah. Yeah, really interesting version of Whitman, sort of a more constrained blab of the pave and not out there on the street the way Whitman thought was primary. But like Schuyler, looking from inside through a window.
Exactly,
yeah. Interesting. Shoshana, hi.
Hi.
You were part of ModPo, gosh, way back. I mean, 2013 maybe?
Mm-hmm. Was my first year, yeah.
Amazing. And it's a long time.
And I'm still here, yeah.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And sometimes you show up at Mandana's.
At the meetup groups, yeah.
How many of you have ever gone to Mandana's? Look at this. It's like
They're legion.
We call it Mandana's group for short, but sort of that's what they are. Anyway, Shoshana, what do you think of this poem?
Yeah, I mean, what strikes me is kind of like this one lonely stop sign against like a big expanse of the world kind of thing. And then there's also just like the shapes of everything kind of just like fading away, like space, buildings, windows.
Yeah.
It just gets less and less concrete. And then just thinking about that one corner stop sign, trying to stop war in the midst of all of this space.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my reaction.
That's great. Thank you, Shoshana. Could we have snaps for Shoshana? I wonder if Eleni would come up to the table, succeeding John. You're giving me a look. You had a long day at the office, solving academic administrative problems, and here you are doing poetry, and you have no idea what we're going to talk about. What? What'd you say? And wait, deans don't create. Sorry, vice provosts don't create. Okay. Do you want to come up?
See what happens.
Okay, that's great. I love people. People are willing at the end of the day to do intellectually hard things. I love you all. People are shaking their heads.
We love you too, Al.
What?
We love you too, Al.
Oh, thank you, Davey. So you just made my week. You always are nice to me when you see me.
That's because I like you.
I think you worry about me.
Yes,
you
I worry
okay?
about you.
Davey says, "Are you okay?" How about? Do you have the Twitter?
Yeah.
How about just quote some tweets? Let's see what happens. 610-616-3208 is the number. 610-616-3208.
I wrote a tweet, but I didn't send it.
Oh. This
Send
is
it,
really
then I'll
cool.
read it.
This has never happened before. Wait, you're going to quote a tweet that hasn't been sent yet. This is webcasting at its best. Like, go ahead, let's hear it.
So I was thinking about chronic meanings while you were talking about the other poem.
You were not paying attention, basically, but that's okay.
Well, I was
Eisner would have
cutting,
loved that.
and I was thinking about cutting off as not being an ending. The cutting off really implied so much more. It sort of opened a whole space of silence, and it implied something much more optimistic, that there was something further that was going to happen. So in that silence, we don't know when Lee Hickman is going to die, but it's the incompleteness points to something that's going to be completed at some point.
That was longer than a tweet.
Yeah, that's why I couldn't send it.
That was so beautiful. Really, really good.
I can
You
go
know,
back
I
and-
think I'm starting to riff on the blank at the end of the 5 words, and even though there's a period there, so Bob he wants us to think of it as a sentence. But I keep thinking of the for lack of a better phrase, therapeutic moment, the moment in therapy when you get to the point where you finally get to the thing that you can't say, that the unsayable is at the end of every sentence, and that the first 5 words, as Davey and others pointed out, are just routines. They're mostly non-important. But it's the thing that's important is the unsayable thing. And the unsayable is the cipher, the openness, the X that we all come for. That's why we need art. We don't need art for the first 5 words. We need art to figure out what that blank is.
It's creating the space for that silence, which isn't necessarily dark. The lack of the word is not a dark
and
thing.
I think Aigner knew something about that. No clouds cross the sky, space, buildings, windows. I mean, Aigner finds words for that blankness, but you always have a feeling that the blankness is there. I mean, Aigner knew a lot about, though chronic is not the right word for CP. There's no improvement. There's some degeneration. Basically, he learned to cope with the physical limitations, but other than that, he seemed to understand where this was all going, and it was going to space and silence and not being able to choose the words. And yet he filled them in with words, which is what's so heroic about what he did. Tweets.
Yeah, tweets.
You already earned your keep.
Let's see. So we've got Stephanie says, "Oh, I love the problem moments." When we were having a little
Couldn't do the audio. Thanks, Stephanie.
That was great.
Stephanie who? What? Oh, yeah, I know that.
Yeah.
That's Stephanie.
And then that same Stephanie quotes you saying, "During becomes an after, and then after gets put on the before." Wow. At UPenn.
You redeemed yourself, Stephanie.
I love that she tagged Penn
Complains about the audio and then praises my existential
that was
bullshit.
awesome.
Yeah.
Let's see. And then Colleen Knight says, "For the love of Pete, whomever he is, I'm fashionably late. Guess I'm the Baroness in the wrong week."
Colleen Knight. Colleen, get in your car and drive to Hudson. Yeah. Colleen is in Toronto, I think.
Yep. And then Jim wants to know what the deal is with Seattle.
Jim, we're coming.
Yeah.
We're coming to Seattle. We were supposed to talk about that on the train.
Yeah, we didn't.
ModPo team's going to Seattle. Chris, Seattle?
Chris is in.
Zach, Seattle? Okay. We're about to reveal this. We're thinking of renting a car and driving up to Vancouver to do some filming of some Canadian Vancouver poets. There are a lot of them. It's a very important poetry place. Mm-hmm. So we're thinking of doing that, and that means we're never coming back. I have tickets to the opera on that Wednesday, and we're going to be in Vancouver on Tuesday, so I'm not sure how this is all going to work out. Another tweet?
January is the answer.
January, yeah. Jim will let you know.
Yeah, it'll be January.
All right, good.
Kim Coveney writes, "Corner stop sign, arrowy traffic, arrowy poem," which I love. And then Kim also writes, "The incompleteness points to something that's going to be complete. # the unsayable."
Wow, okay.
So there's a lot of...
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Okay, Jason, are you there? Hi, buddy.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Jason and Davey and Anna, you guys are up next, and then Eleni. I'm going to read you some paratactic, non sequitur. What? You're laughing at me?
Not yet.
I'm going to read some non sequitur sentences in Albany, in Ron Silliman's Albany.
Great.
And what I want you to do, Jason, did I say Jason and then Anna?
Yeah.
And then did I say Davey after that?
You did.
And then Eleni. What I want you to do is just don't make sense of it, but respond to it. The question is, the so-called new sentence, which is foundational particularly for Hyginian and Silliman, the idea of putting sentences out there that don't connect, that don't lead one to the other, which is now something pretty familiar, but was really, really, it was very Steinian, so it wasn't super new, but it was pretty new. And the question becomes, how do you read the space between? How do you connect them? And if you give up the idea of connecting, how do you receive all this information? And what accidental cause and effect relationships are made when you just put sentences seemingly randomly together? I'm going to read this twice. It's from Albany. And Albany is partly about growing up in the 60s and dealing with the politics of the 60s. It's also about later and earlier. Okay. Music is essential. Is that me? I don't think it's me, is it? Okay.
Not me.
It's like live television in the 1950s. I feel like Milton Berle or something. Like, okay, what's going on?
Take the phone out on the street.
Yeah.
Take the mic out on the street.
Okay, here I go again. Parataxis,
All right.
Albany, right. Music is essential. The cops wear shields that serve as masks. Her lungs heavy with asbestos. 2 weeks too old to collect orphans' benefits. A woman on a train asks Angela Davis for an autograph. You get your Miranda. As if a correct line would somehow solve the future. They murdered his parents just to make the point. It's not easy if your audience doesn't identify as readers. I put through that last one in because it's so meta. All right, I'm going to read it again, and then we're going to go to Jason. Want quickly, Jason, Anna, Davey, Eleni. Music is essential. The cops wear shields that serve as masks. Just those two are fantastic. Her lungs heavy with asbestos. 2 weeks too old to collect orphans' benefits. A woman on a train asks Angela Davis for an autograph. You get read your Miranda. As if a correct line would somehow solve the future. They murdered his parents just to make the point. It's not easy if your audience doesn't identify as readers. All right, Jason, quick
All
thought?
right. Yeah. I think something that's so paradoxical about language poets' work often is how much it actually draws our attention to authorship in the way in which the words don't create a false sense of their own necessary flow.
Wow.
Kind of that the author is merely a conduit for.
Wow.
We get a sense of an active thinking person who is having a life, a nonlinear life.
Wow.
Which life is.
And that counterintuitively points all the more to the author.
Exactly.
Doing the authoring.
And,
that's crazy
ahead.
radical. Because
Yeah.
I mean, basically what you're saying is that when Charles Dickens got on the groove, like here's another installment, it's really going along, and I got this, and this is naturally going to happen, and Pip's going to London, and then this happens. And he's sort of creating something that is an illusion of his not doing it, but it's being written, it's what happens when people go to London and they're young, and they want to make it in the city. And
Right.
we pseudo forget about Dickens. But what's happening here is that the person saying this is created, this non-context has to be created by someone. This goes back to modernism. This is really what Williams was doing with the broken green glass. Thank you, Jason. That was fantastic. I want to turn.
One more quick thing that I noticed for the first time about Albany, and it's in a word. It's one of the lines that you read.
Yeah.
Is I actually picked out 3 lines that call across. Well, what Albany does is create a matrix of meaning, not a line of meaning.
Right.
It creates a landscape of possible correspondences.
Yeah.
And I just was really struck by these 3 lines.
Yeah.
A line is the distance between, as if a correct line would somehow solve the future.
Yes.
Children form lines at the end of each recess.
Yes. Line is a big word here because it means sentence. It also means line, not sentence. It also means political line, towing the line.
Right.
It also,
also
means
a
what
line
you do when you follow
that
someone
can-
else. Yeah.
A line that can continue.
That's right. Very nice. Okay. Anna, was it Allie too? Anna?
Davey.
Anna, Davey, Eleni, and then we're going to go to the phone. Quick thought, Anna?
I'm just thinking about, I think part of the project of this poem is that each line is meant to be read both personally and politically. Is that right?
That's right. 100
100
sentences. Each one can be read as a political statement and a personal statement.
Right, and I think that gets dicey is the word I want to use, I think, because sometimes the danger of parataxis is that it ends up sort of folding in and flattening a lot of experience altogether.
Right.
Like the cops wear shields that serve as masks, her lungs heavy with asbestos. Like when you use parataxis, sometimes it means that you can sort of like flatten out a whole bunch of, in this particular poem, like really gnarly experiences. Like this poem is very fraught. Like there's a lot of, people are experiencing a lot of really dangerous and precarious like situations in this poem. But what ends up happening, I think, like a critic of this poem might read it that way, might read it as flattening. But I really like Jason's word matrix, because by creating like this personal, political, collective, individual, right, just like totality of experience, you end up with a poem that really is trying to do that work of expressing a personal and a collective sort of like anguish.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Davey, briefly?
I'm going to go out on a limb here in a way that everyone's very used to and read line also with...
That's not going out on a limb.
Indeed.
You don't understand. You can't go out on a limb and say, I always go out on a limb, because we know, you're going out on a limb.
Because it's the same limb. But I think it's relevant here, which is to say it's not a limb.
Same limb? I don't follow. Anyway.
In that I think the other way to read... Another way to read line...
That would be new.
Yes, dear. Another way to read line is highway. And the reason that I think that's relevant here is that Silliman's writing about, the 50s to the 80s in the Bay Area, in a moment where the Bay Area has been really radically disinvested and radically and crazily suburbanized. And I think that the point of the parataxis is that, like, you can talk about things that sound as though they are different, but they are necessarily all imbued with the same structures of power on their surface, that it's impossible to make an observation that's not about a crushing relationship to spatialized inequality. And that's, we know that Ron Silliman is someone who thinks a ton about public space and systems. We get that in Bart, but we also get that here, that I think the point of the language poets in part is that you can't write a poem about your life in the late 70s or 80s in the US without making observations about your embedded experience that don't all tie back to a critique of and an embeddedness within structures of power.
That was great. Thank you. Eleni, what are you going to do?
Well, I love this poem because I think it's more like regular speech than regular speech. I think when we all talk to each other, we think we understand what the other person is saying. And I think that what's so exciting about this poem is that it encourages us to appreciate that what we always think we understand, we actually don't. And I am also thinking about the analog to painting. As a painter, I'm very mindful that you want to leave space in the work, because the eye will actually do the job of mixing the colors by the very looking at them. So the last line that the audience, it sort of is, it gives it away, that the reader, the viewer, the person listening is really a partner in the creation of the meaning.
Right. Which is a hallmark of the language poet.
Which is kind of interesting, because the person speaking thinks they have something to say, but even they might not know what they are saying until it's heard.
Yeah, that's great. We have aspired. We're going to go to the phone, and then I'm going to ask Max, Gabe, and Erica to comment on whatever's on the phone. And I'd also like to ask Susan, would you come up to the front? Can we put our hands together for Eleni? She was great. What Eleni just said is we aspire to, in ModPo, in this weird pedagogy, we aspire to the same co-creative relationship that some of the later poets whom we admire try to create in relation to readers, listeners, participants. So we're doing a kind of structurally imitative project, which often doesn't work, but sometimes really works, such as I think tonight with all the great, surprising, like we're all surprising ourselves with improvised thoughts that turn out to be really new and brilliant, commenting on poems that have been much discussed. That's the good thing. I mean, people say, why are you keep offering the same course? The answer is because with, this 10,000 people or that 13,000 people or that 32,000 people, with enough people through Twitter and New York meetups or whatever, we're going to find something new to say every single time. And it's going to wind up making us say new things, which is just freaky when you think about it. Hi, Susan.
Hi.
So who do we have on the phone?
Speaking of Seattle, we have Nicholas calling
Cool.
from Seattle.
Hey.
Hi, Nick.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, I saw you on the forums or I don't know where, and I realized you're in Seattle, and I meant to say we're coming to Seattle.
Oh.
We really
well,
are.
I thought it was a bit of, I heard you mention Seattle, so I decided to call. Seems like
that's
a
great.
bit of synchronicity there. So.
You're Nicholas Stern, right?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
also go by Denny, but
Denny, that's right.
I mean, I'm
Listen,
Nicholas.
you sent me something. I just received it yesterday. You sent me this beautiful book, which is hand drawn, right, Denny?
Yeah, it's concrete poetry.
I know, it's so beautiful, and I really meant to thank you, but I haven't had a chance. It's sitting on my desk. Thank you. How cool.
Oh, hey, thanks.
Yeah. Do you just want to call us from Seattle, or do you have a question or comment?
Well, also sort of, there's the, I guess it's Robert Grenier. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, Grenier.
Anyways,
Yeah.
The 100 Sentences.
Yeah.
Which is, I guess in a way it's kind of a concrete poem. I mean, it's not like drawn, but there's it has a concrete quality. And I'd like to quote Robert Grenier from. This is something that I was listening to him in an interview with Charles Bernstein from, I don't know, about 10 or 15 years ago, and he said something that was kind of cool. So I don't know. I mean, maybe you want to riff off of it, but I'll give you the quote.
Great.
He said, I like the imaginative, projective capacity of language, creating a circumstance which is conjunct with the extra linguistic reality. I'll read that again because it's kind of a mouthful.
All right.
He said, I like the imaginative, projective capacity of language, creating a circumstance which is conjunct with extra linguistic reality.
Nick, that's great.
So,
you know what I'm going to...
I mean, maybe that's what's happening right now, right?
Yeah.
In talking
sort of
about
what I was
poetics.
saying.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of ways to think about that, I guess.
Nick, what I'm going to do...
I thought that might be a good thing to riff off of.
No, it is. Absolutely. What I'm going to do, we've never done Grenier. We've never talked about Grenier in the Week 8 webcast, and we're about to. It's going to get weird. I want to say one thing about what Grenier's done lately, and then you'll hang up and listen to our responses through the webcast. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little bit of Grenier. It's actually him talking about his poem cards and not reading from them, unfortunately, so I won't play it. Okay. All right. Let me just tell you, Nick, before you hang up, that Grenier lately has been doing something you would much like. He takes, is it 4 colors? Anybody know? He has 4 colors pens, those green, red, Bics. They're Bics, right? And he's been slow writing words. He's been slowing himself down, writing words just so they're distorted and unreadable, so that when you read them, you have to work at what is he saying. But he writes things like blossom in the tree. But in a way that makes it completely impossible to read it quickly. So he's trying to slow us down, and it's concrete poetry. And when he's performed at the Writer's House, it takes like 4 hours. We give him an hour, and it takes 4 hours, and he's still talking about one piece. This is the amazing thing that he's done. Nick, thank you so much for calling.
Okay.
Thank you. We'll see you in Seattle. We'll be in touch.
Okay, thanks.
Great. So I'm going to turn to Erica, Max, and Gabe, and I'm going to ask them to say anything that they like about the language poets. You can pick out, you can shout out a language poet or a poem. You can say something about language poetry that hasn't been said, and we'll see where we'll go from there. So Erica, Max, Gabe. Oh, I want to add Jake to that too. So it's going to be quick, rapid fire. Erica first.
Okay. I'm a fan of the language poets because I think that they really open one up to the possibility of poetry.
Yeah.
And in particular, this week, I've been really excited I'm always excited by Harriet Mullen, and I also really love the Tyrone Williams and the Bruce Andrews that are both the ModPo Plus.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Erica. Yeah, those new poems in ModPo Plus are just really add a lot to this week. Max, a thought on the language poets?
Just to go off of Nick's comment on the call about the Grenier and a little bit about what you were saying about what Grenier is doing recently, Al. Trying to think a little bit about what Nick quoted in terms of the extra linguistic reality. I can't exactly remember what he said, but it was pretty cool, and it stuck with me.
Yeah.
And the Sentences Project is pretty cool. I'm just looking at the box again with all of those cards in it, and there's something that's very inviting and playful about this this material manifestation of poetry that's a little bit different from, I think, some of the works that we'll encounter in the last 2 weeks, specifically some of these kind of Herculean Kenny Goldsmith works where there's this sort of like frantic energy to transcribe something that nobody wants to read, and how that's sort of in contrast with this very welcoming, playful Grenier work of just inviting you to kind of open up this box and sit with all these sentences and make your own words out of it. And then also just what you were talking about, this sort of slowing down of writing is really lovely. It's sort of meditative. It's a different kind of energy than the sort of transcribing energy or even the aleatory energy that we'll encounter later.
Yeah. Thank you, Max. That was fantastic. I'm glad we're doing this. Gabe, what's your thought on the language poets, having gone back to them again?
I have many, but to stick to kind of Grenier mostly, we should notice how much the language poets love the typewriter. It's like the quintessential tool of the language poetry school, not just because, well, some of them are writing on it, but you look at somebody like Grenier's sentences, or Aram Saroyan, who I mentioned earlier, or even Bernstein and things like that, and there's this real focus on that touching of the type, the feel of the language being put on the page. So when you look at sentences, even in its online version, you've got something like Cookies over Lake Superior, but put on that in a single line in that type font on a big card. And that's what I think Grenier is so good at, and Grenier really works like in typewriter form quite often. I think Grenier is so good at making something feel like so mechanical and so wonderful at the same time, which is why I love those pen drawings, because they are childish and strange and kind of difficult, but when you finally read it, it's so like lovely, naturalistic, romantic imagery. So you have Grenier doing this kind of comedy routine when he reads it, where he's like, "What did I write right there?"
Yeah.
Oh,
he doesn't even know. Gabe, did you see him at the Writer's House when he was there last? Yeah.
Readings we had, because it was just like, it was him and oh my god, I'm forgetting his name, but the 2 giant volume books of basically the same poem over and over again, slightly changed about the day.
Stephen Radcliffe.
Stephen Radcliffe.
Yeah.
Stephen
Radcliffe. Yeah.
Super meditative, like monster book for about 30 minutes, and then you had the 30-minute stand-up routine of Grenier reading his own things. But both of them were just thinking about like landscape art.
Yeah.
It was great.
Totally right, Gabe. That's great. Jake, what are your thoughts about the language poets?
I remember hearing a recording of Eileen Miles kind of doing like almost like an improvised talk poem introduction at a reading, and she referenced language poets, and she said, and the way I understand language poets, it's like the brain walked in. And I like that a lot. And, I think like a lot of language poetry brings together, philosophy and literary theory, and it's really intellectual. But at the same time, I think the playfulness that Gabe and Max mentioned is there too in different ways, and certainly humor, and also and this is especially resonant for me, the music that a lot of the language poets seem to reference and know a lot about jazz. And I'm specifically thinking about a performance that I was at where Bruce Andrews was reading off of these cards. And there was a dancer, and there was like kind of improvised music happening at the same time. And it was like, the continuing Erica's riff on extra linguistic reality. That the quote, I think that was extra linguistic reality, just like these disconnected little phrases that in interaction with dance and music definitely created something extra linguistic and playful and awesome, and not just the brain, not just the big brain that's there, but also like these other
Body too,
things.
yeah. Jake, thank you very much. I worry when you get very enthusiastic here, because there are these really sharp kitchen implements above you. I'm really worried about what's going to happen. They look very sharp. Susan?
Barbecue.
Yeah, be careful. Please be careful. Susan, I want to switch it up and just ask you to reflect on your experience in this setting, not tonight, I mean just generally going to meetups and reading the poem along with people around the world. And
I think this experience has been really amazing. I really enjoyed school, and
you're one of those.
Yeah, and this is an expanded version of learning that I have really enjoyed participating in, both in line, where I sometimes have time to collect my thoughts and can write a coherent post,
right?
But then to meet everybody in person makes it even more impressive. And I think that you all must know thousands of names, because it seems like you recognize everyone who calls in.
It's kind of an illusion, but not really.
Yeah.
So what is it like? Can you describe what it's like to have been interacting with someone online and then come to a meetup and there they are in person? The cliche is it's a little bit disappointing sometimes.
Oh, it's a little bit disappointing, but everybody can be. Not here, but everybody is who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And can we, so this is a relatively new thing, going from an online connection, an online relationship, to a face-to-face relationship. Often we form a relationship, then we go away or move away, or we're separated by a vacation or something, and then we interact that way. But this is reversing that. And for so many of us associated with ModPo over the years, you very much start not knowing the person in person. Can you say a little more about that transition? Is it okay? Does it require new kinds of adjustment? What's the effect of it?
The effect overall is good. It brings you further into the community, which I think is what you're creating online. And when you're in person, and I have also participated in the group at the New York Public Library, it just brings you further in and makes you feel as much a part of the community as people who have participated for many years.
Yeah, Thank you very much. Would you stay at the table when we do final words? I'll ask you to offer a final word. What I thought, since we're in New York and it's week 8, I thought I would do something we've done before in the week 8 webcast, which is to play Charles Bernstein's performance of In a Restless World Like This Is, which is his post 9/11 poem. And I'll ask Mandana, who's got the mic, to be the first to comment. And then what I'll do is I'll look around to my colleagues here at the table and also those in the meetups to see who might be raising a hand to offer a comment on this 9/11 poem. So the poem was read when Charles came to Penn from Buffalo. He moved to a new university. He had published this book, and he had written a couple of poems that are responses to 9/11. And the recording, it was made in the garden of the writer's house, and it had a really, I don't know if Zach remembers this, but it had a real, well, I guess he wasn't here yet. It had a real outdoory feel, and it was a 9/11 kind of weather. It was just, I just remember the reading of the poem as somehow connecting me to that awful day previously. So here is Charles Bernstein.
In a restless world like this is. Not long ago, or maybe I dreamt it or made it up or have suddenly lost track of its train in the hocus pocus of the dissolving days. No, if I bend the turn around the corner, come at it from all 3 sides at once, or bounce the ball against all manner of bleary-eyed fortune tellers, well, you can see for yourselves there's nothing up my sleeves, or notice even rocks occasionally break if enough pressure is applied. As far as you go in one direction, all the further you'll have to go on before the way back has become totally indivisible.
Mandana, you want to take a first crack? Is there a mic on?
Yeah. My first thought is about how effective poetry is in trying to get at very, very difficult issues and very difficult experiences and the sort of things that we find so difficult to get into, to talk about. And that poetry is uniquely suited to that. And Charles is kind of a master of doing that with a lot of personal issues for himself. So how he roundabout, I'm almost thinking Ashberyan, doing the circuit.
Just walking around
and getting somewhere. Not to a point, not for a meaning per se, but to get somewhere, and to get somewhere with the reader, with each other.
Yeah, thank you, Mandana. I'm looking at my colleagues. If you have a thing to say about this poem, just sort of signal to me. They're all just stock still. Susan.
Yes, I was thinking about this this line not long ago, or maybe I dreamt it, which did remind me, and this goes to show you how much I've been thinking about ModPo. Last night I discovered a poem by Frank O'Hara that nobody...
You dreamt that you found one.
that no one had known about previously, so...
How did it go?
I don't remember.
Was it good?
It was good, though, and it was just what I needed to hear.
That was fantastic.
That's a great dream.
That's so freaky. Dreams are amazing. Allie, what are you thinking when you hear this poem again for the millionth time? You're a New Yorker.
I am a New Yorker. I was here on 9/11. Yeah, I usually the last couple of lines, as far as you go in one direction, all the further you'll have to go before the way back has become totally indivisible. There's such, it points to such decision that you're not even aware of making, which I think in a way language the language poets are always dealing, I'm kind of thinking again about chronic meanings. There could be so many ways to complete or continue those 5-word sentences. And yet you stop in the middle or you stop after 5 words. And like the way that what this poem makes me think about life is you're going to just end up, like there's something that you can do in poetry that you can't really do in life, which is decide to kind of impose rules that are just more articulate than winding up at a place where how you got there is totally indivisible or untraceable in some manner.
That was lovely. Mandana, can you give the mic to some? Is there someone who would like to respond? Eric will. So I want to pose a question about this to Davey, and then we'll turn to Eric, and then we're going to go all the way around for final words. Okay, everybody will get a final thought. Davey, this poem is about Manhattan. It's about, I think it's actually about walking all the way uptown, Upper West, having been downtown for something. I'm not really sure about that, but I think it's about a grid, a city that's above 14th Street. You know, it's a grid, and you know where to go. You absolutely do. I mean, as long as you have, like, if you know that it's the end of the day and the sun is over there by Jersey, then if that's on your left and you walk forward, you're walking north. You just know it. You don't even have to even look at the signs, and most of the signs can't be read at this point. You just, so you know where you are. And below 14th Street is another question, and that's in fact where the destruction was, so that kind of screws up what I'm saying. But it strikes me as New York is the kind of city where you can orient yourself, and this is a poem about utter disorientation in a city that had always oriented you. How could it be that now we don't know where to go? We're lost in the city, built on a rock, right? The rock is in there, Davey. Nothing up my sleeves, or notice even rocks occasionally break if enough pressure is applied. Even Manhattan can break, Thoughts? You think about the city and you think about orientation a lot.
Something that I'm thinking about as you're offering that reading of the poem is that a grid gives the illusion that you can always go back, that you can go back to a location where you've been before. You can go back to a coordinate. You can say, meet me at the northeast corner of 14th Street and 7th Avenue. And like, that's always the same location. And cities are so complicated and messy and like very hard to talk about. And like part of what poetry gives us is a gift for talking about the like maddening multiplicity of being in urban space.
Yeah, which we've been talking about a lot.
Totally. And I think that like there's very much a through line through the ModPo poems of thinking about them as urban poems. But something that's amazing about this poem is that it's dealing with the simultaneous, like, I orient myself in this grid, and I also understand that, like, the city that I leave as I walk uptown never exists ever again. And, like, the way that this operates for me as a 9/11 poem is that it's about understanding that irreplaceability or in the impossibility of being able to revisit the city that you leave, like, when you commute. Like on a daily basis, you're leaving a place and going somewhere else, and you can't ever go back to the place that you left ever again, even if it's like 8 hours later. That's what it is to live in a city, and that's what it is to live in a globalized, radically gentrifying city, is that like when you go home from this webcast, it's the same, but it's not. And that's something that 9/11 brings home for some people in a way that for many New Yorkers, that had been true about the city for a long time.
Gives a new sense to the phrase restless world. Right. Always changing. Eric Fretz, a thought on this?
Yeah, a couple small thoughts. So one, when you're talking about orientation, and it's different below 14th Street, but the one thing where you still were oriented below 14th Street, you'd look down 6th Avenue and you'd see the World Trade Center. So that was an orientation, even when the grid was gone. But then
kind of a South Star.
When wasn't there, but then that was gone. But what makes you read this as a 9/11 poem besides what's outside the poem? I mean, is it, from what I see of the title and the poem, it's not obviously a 9/11 poem. And I actually like that about the poem because there's something problematic about saying, oh my God, it was 9/11 that changed everything and it was so horrible when horrible things are going around all around the world in other countries. And what got me about this, so I read it as a little bit more universal than that. And okay, that may be what the spark that made him write the poem, but I think he was writing about something more than that. So just my initial thought reading it without thinking about 9/11, just from starting with the title, was the way that, I mean, it's a real exercise in mixed metaphors. The corner, the turning, the bouncing the ball, the one going from, you think each start of a phrase thinks this is going to be a phrase that's going to be used to mean something, and it turns into another phrase. And the meaning is constantly put off. And then those wonderful last two lines about no matter how far you go, and the way back, which is singular, becomes indivisible. How can something that's singular be? You say that about different things, not about one thing. It definitely makes me think about turning around and going back over the poem again. And when do all those mixed poems, are they indivisible? And what is that way back? That's all I can.
You're good, Eric. Snaps for Eric Fretz. Holy shit. That was really great. Yeah, I mean, I see New York. I see Charles growing up in New York. I see stoop ball in here. I see fortune tellers. Of course, there are fortune tellers everywhere, but I see the tension between the New York of the bad days of the mid-'70s and the word indivisible, of course, is an American word. It's part of the Pledge of Allegiance. So I see, so yes, it can be read that way, but it also can be read, as you say, universally. There's a group of ModPo poets. They're ModPo people who are poets, led by Imad Majid in Colombo, Sri Lanka, who got really into ModPo the first couple of years. They took this poem and they gathered together one night and turned a recorder on, and they made a video of themselves talking about this poem. I put them in touch with Charles, and in fact, when Anna and I started to collect essays for our book, a ModPo book, which is going to be called...
We hope The Difference is Spreading.
The Difference is Spreading, 50 poets on 50 poems.
We got to argue with the publisher about that.
50 ModPo poems, and this is one of them. And when we try to figure out who the poet should be to write about this New York poem, we reached out to Imad Majid, and he wrote the most beautiful 9/11 poem from Sri Lanka.
Well, and he revised it right after the bombings that happened over Easter in Sri Lanka.
He actually was in exile, or took himself out of the country, and he was on an island somewhere when he wrote his essay about this. And he revised it to account for the Sri Lankan disaster. And so, yes, Eric, obviously this poem speaks to Imad and others. Okay, so thank you. This has been great. We're going to do final words, and it's got to be quick, so I'm going to call around, and we're going to start with Erica Kaufman. Erica, final thought?
I really appreciated what was just said about Charles's poem, and I'm now thinking about one of the things that I think is so interesting and what draws me to the language poets more broadly, but I think it applies for me to this particular poem by Charles, is the idea that poetry is an act of building something. It's an act of construction. And it sort of reclaims language as a site for invention.
Yeah.
So in other words, in a restless world like this is, the addition of the word is really changes the entire tenor of the poem. And, if you're somebody who's in your person, you might see that it's post 9/11, but it's applicable in any place where the words are allowed to mean the way that they mean for the person reading the poem.
Yes, thank you, Erica. Thanks for joining us tonight. I want to go to Jake next, and then Allie, and then I want to make sure that Christine gets the mic to be able to do a final thought. I don't know where the mic is. So, Jake first.
I was looking at Kafka's aphorisms this week, and I'm thinking about one where he says, the true path is not somewhere up above. It's not a trapeze line somewhere up above. It's really more like down below. It's more like tripwire, is what he says. And I just, throughout this session, I kept thinking, kind of language poetry really does something similar. It points to like the line somewhere up above the trapeze, and then there's like this tripwire that's like tripping you up into something very real and gritty, and like the rocks that you were talking about just earlier, Al.
Thank you, Jake, and have fun at the meetup in a few hours. Let's go to Allie next, and then Christine.
I've been thinking a lot about the word matrix and matrices for the past hour, whenever it got brought up. Just to go back to corner stop sign, when you get we have this kind of traffic scene, even if it's orderly, maybe it's not, and then it's space, buildings, windows, and like you could also read that as like space. The cosmos, which like creates, even on the page, like it kind of like simulates just this like matrix, right? And I was still thinking about that when we were talking about the nature of ModPo and returning to poems, and how each kind of like new assemblage of people just like creates new meanings, and just how ModPo is like this massive, endless, deep matrix.
Cool. Thank you so much, Allie. Christine, your final thoughts?
Well, I started by sort of stating the obvious, which is that we're all in a room together and all in a conversation together. We're sitting here in a library, a home for words, and I want to tell you why it struck me so much that we're all together here, and that is because Sal and I both spend most of our days here dealing with piles and piles of pieces of paper that people marked with words. Like behind you, Anna, that image, which I think might be Puccini, but we're so in touch with that moment when, whether it was a poet or a novelist or a composer, marked the page, made that moment of creation. We are like physically in touch constantly with those pieces of paper that are the traces of the moment of creation. And yet I'm rarely in a room like this where we're talking amongst ourselves about what happens when those words and creations get out into the world and when we talk about them together. So what may have seemed so obvious to you, for me, it was a very important reminder that what starts with marking the page is completely transformed once we get into a community like this. That's my final word.
Thank you, Christine. And also, let's put our hands together for Christine, who's made this evening possible. I want to turn to Max and then Jason for final thoughts.
Completely tenuous connection out there. But Al, when you were talking about the way that New York becomes a grid above 14th Street, just made me think of the 14 lines in the sonnet of that poem. This is really like speculative interpretation, but I just wanted to put that out there. I'm sure maybe Davey might have something to say about
I love that. That's really cool. I mean, sonnets are like cities. I mean, they're really hard to keep, the way they're supposed to. And there's endless variations of the grid, like sonnets. The sonnet as the city. Sounds like a new program. Thank you, Max, and great to see you. Jason, hey, final thought. Jason, you muted yourself.
Muted myself. Hi.
There you go.
Hi, Jason. Hey.
When I heard the plane fly over, I ran up to my rooftop and there was Eileen Miles, who lived next door. And
What? Is that real?
It's true.
Wow.
It's in one of her poems.
Yeah.
And we talked about poetry and talked about what was happening and talked about, we both kept kind of going back to look at our televisions and then coming back up. And the city was closed to cars below 14th Street. There was no, it was a time of a strange inhabitation of place where the experience, like we've talked about earlier, an experience or a realization goes back and transforms everything that comes before. And in a way, this poem for me, that I end up dwelling kind of on the last word, on the indivisible, and the indivisibility of time and experience, and the illusion of moving forward through linear time, and which makes you think of chronic meanings, in which there are some lines that are complete, that express a full thought. But what a full thought is, or what the end of a line of a poem is an opening for more that is changed. As we read the line of the poem, the line transforms in the process of its reading. And I have office hours tonight at 9. Yeah. I'm excited to talk about all these poems.
Great.
So, if you have a chance, come by at 9.
9 Eastern Time. Thank you, Jason. That was very beautiful. As always, you just sort of went back to the question of what happens when the 5 words are done. And it's very Dickinsonian how that's where possibility is, and not in the words as they got written. Sort of a interesting harmonizing with what Christine was saying about the writing and then the receiving, and the two worlds that she wants to inhabit as a fan of art, of the writing arts. Anna, and then Davy, and then Susan gets a final thought, and then me. So, Anna.
Just since we went to Bob Grenier, I'm just going to quote from sentences.
Oh, yeah, great. It's great.
Read a little cloudy, eat good.
Do another.
No, that's it.
Okay. I love the box.
It's so good.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of boxes for sale, by the way.
They're hard to find, but.
No, somebody who works with him has it. They made a bunch, and I think they're $500, which, by the way, is the right price for this thing.
But it's also available online. You can just click through. So.
Yeah, but it's not a box with cards in it. I love cookies over Lake Superior.
Yeah.
Can I plug doing it online? Like, just open it in your window, and like every day, just click through like 20, and then you'll get through the 500, and it's just like, it's the best.
Yeah, Bob Grenier, amazing guy. Davey.
Something that feels important to say about the language poets in Language Poetry Week is that what's amazing to me about language poetry is that it's simultaneously critical and curious, and it models a really useful form of being discouraged or frustrated or negotiating a system that feels impossible, and figuring out how to be curious and playful about like total structural collapse, which is a tool that I think is really necessary, and necessary in 1980 and differently necessary now. And it's been cool to watch language poets who are still with us continue to use some of the strategies that they developed in a different political and climatological and social moment and feel that they are still useful. And there's a real gift in being able to be optimistic and curious about like deep and structural pessimism. And if you're interested in thinking about those things together, I want to shout out Charles's amazing program, Close Listening, which feels like a version of what language poetry is, a version of close listening to everything. And he's a very gifted interviewer and listener to other poets. And if you haven't gotten to listen to old episodes of Close Listening, go look them up. They're online. And they're really just amazing conversations between people.
Fantastic. Yes, they're all in pen sound. Thank you, Davey, as always. Susan, your final thought?
I just want to say thank you so much for making the museum available tonight and for inviting me to the table. I think I represent ModPo because this is what ModPo does, is it invites people to the table. And I couldn't be more happy to be here.
Does that
So
mean you're
thank
going to
you.
go out drinking with us after?
I can't. I got to go back to the burbs.
Oh, well, we can delay that. I mean, I think traffic is easier going back to the suburbs after a drink. No, actually, that was a misstatement. That was a misstatement. The traffic is lighter after time has passed.
This is true.
Right? You can have your hot cocoa.
This is true.
So I want to conclude with two things. First is to quote Thayer Corey, who wrote this beautiful thing earlier today, I think, that I just really captured the spirit of what's happening in ModPo right now. And then I want to end with Susan Howe, which is where we began, but it's a different book, The Midnight. I want to say something about that and the Morgan and the Houghton and the archive generally. So Thayer Corey wrote this lovely thing. It speaks for itself. Good morning, Al. I can only stay for a minute. This was my office hour. But I want to add my name to the list of ModPoers who have found the experience transformative. I signed up for the course hoping it would help me become a better reader of poetry. I often read poems, scratch my head, feel in the dark, and give up. ModPo has turned the lights on, and the world has tilted to a slightly different, more luminous axis. But I'm also blown away by how connected I felt to other participants and to the interns. I assume he means not just actually our intern Claire, but the teaching assistants, who now seem like friends. I find myself anticipating what each person might say because I'm getting to know their points of view and their quirky likes and dislikes. I juggle a lot of balls in my life, most of them satisfying and meaningful. So I have to fit ModPo into the interstices of time. But right now, I wish it were the other way around. ModPo at the center, everything else on the sidelines. Thanks to you and your team for a life-giving, life-changing experience. You want to know why we keep doing this? That's the answer. Thayer Corey, thank you so much. Final thought about this book, Zach. Oh, you knew I was going to do this. The Midnight. So Anna, what happens? So Susan Howe writes My Emily Dickinson, which is partly based on her visits to the Houghton Library, where she examined the manuscript of the poem that we started with today, My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun. And if you know Susan Howe, you know she's really invested in the way Dickinson wrote. The dash tilting up, not an M dash, you know, and all that stuff. We've all been through that thinking.
Or marginalia, all that kind of stuff.
Then she writes this book. And what's in the middle of this book, Anna?
Like the exact middle? Or the part that we talked about?
Yeah.
There's a sort of, she has kind of an extended riff, anecdote, remembrance. My Emily Dickinson came out in 1985. I think this was in the early 90s. And she writes about the feeling of, Christine kind of alluded to this earlier, the feeling of exclusion, the feeling of I don't belong, the feeling of this archive at Harvard is like really close to me because I'm Susan Howe, poet, not Susan Howe,
scholar,
PhD, you know, whatever, even though she was a professor at Buffalo and she was, you know, the anxiety was really real. The imposter syndrome was really real. And it's painful to read just how like anxious she was and how these like institutional gatekeepers prevented her the person who did and can do the most with the Emily Dickinson archive. Painful to hear how those institutional gatekeepers prevented her because of stupid things like, you don't have this kind of ID, or like this, you didn't bring your curator's permission letter, and like all that bullshit.
It is important to note that most of that feeling was in Susan's anxiety, that they were ready to let her in, that she was all set to do it, and it was really about her imposter syndrome. It was really about how the Houghton seemed like not the place for her. And she does a really great close reading of the architecture and how forbidding it seems. She talks about the institutional gaze. She's worried about her appearance. She's worried about that her ID uses her married name rather than Susan Howe, and she worries about just being a poet. But then she enters and works with the manuscript and winds up, the story precedes the making of this book, and winds up writing a most amazing, seemingly non-scholarly book. So this is kind of a plea to all poets and non-scholars, I guess I would generalize, to get thee to your nearest archive, have the right ID and so forth, and get in there and work with curators who are dying to meet people who want to work with this material. And try to get over the imposter complex. One thing that connects Thayer Corey's comment and the comments of many of you people here and what Susan Howe went through when she created her Emily Dickinson was this idea that as a sort of citizen, joining the citizenry of ModPo makes you eligible to go deeply into these materials. And here we are in an archive celebrating that. So one more time, let's put our hands together for the folks at the Morgan who helped us, including Sal. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Good to see you. I think Jason is literally the only one left in the Hangouts. Everybody else had to go. Anna, thank you so much.
Yep.
And for coordinating a lot of this thing that we did tonight, which was kind of difficult. Allie, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Davey, good to see you.
Thanks so.
Susan, thanks for sitting at the table. And John and Eric and Mandana and Eleni and everybody else who joined us in the conversation, and Nick and Philip, Nick from Seattle and Philip from Texas for calling, and Chris and Zach who got in a car and came up and put all these crazy wires together and have a big cleanup job, which means they're going to be late to our trip to the bar. John, did you find a bar for us? Okay, we're going to find a place, but I'm sure that Christine and Sal have some ideas because they. The archive. Oh, we're going to the archive. I think Susan is going to forget about the suburbs. She's going to take a hotel room. To those of us who are watching from afar, we hope to visit your city. But meantime, we are in this city. I'm a New Yorker, so I'm just going to say the greatest city in the world. We're happy to be here. Thank you for joining us. Please stick with ModPo. Week 9 is weird, aleatory, chance-generated operations. Holy cow. But Shoshana's with it. So we'll see you there. Thanks again.